In this lesson, we're going to take a look at creating a farmland material along with ecosystem layers and using the function editor to create an advanced material graph that we can apply to different terrains and objects and something that'll be reusable. So to start out with, what I want to do is just give us a base terrain to work with, something without a lot of detail because we want to focus more on the material itself. So I'm going to add in procedural terrain, and I'm just going to go ahead and open up the terrain editor, just double click or right click, edit terrain, turn off zero edges, go ahead and edit the function. And right now we just have a simple fractal. What I want to do is change that over to cellular patterns and Voronoi. And then I'm going to, actually we'll go ahead and use Voronoi generalized. It should process a little faster, and then I want to remove some of the roughness and just kind of give us these mounds that we can play with. And bring that down a little. And then if we want, we can also go into the filter and just turn that onto a curve, and that'll kind of round them out a little. We could also go into the profile and increase that a little bit. But I don't want it going too much. We don't want too much depth on the terrain right now, and that should be good. Okay, so I'm going to go over to just in the front view here and scale it down. And then make sure I turn off, I'm going to select the camera and turn off height lock. I don't want the camera moving around because we scale the terrain. I would rather just move it manually. Another thing I want to do is I'm just going to turn off the photometric atmosphere and use something else. I'm going to go to load atmosphere, and under physical, just select the default atmosphere. And we won't worry about lighting later. Right now we just want to focus on just the material and the terrain. This is also pretty small of a terrain for how large of an area we're going to be working with. So I'm going to go ahead and scale it up, bring it down on the Z and up and down axis. And we could smooth this out later if we need to, but this will just give us kind of a base for our material. Okay, so to start, what we're going to do is reset the material. So I'm going to right click up here on the material in the aspect tab and reset it. And then we'll go into the color production, right click, edit. Now, because we're working with and really paying attention to more of a flat surface, I'm going to actually just close that out really quick and go to options right here and set our preview to a 2D plane. Edit the function. That'll give us a 2D plane and just a flat view of the material in the output observer. And then also we want to change this in the function editor. Preview options up here. We'll go to 2D plane, and that'll give us our previews in here also in 2D. So first I want to look at, we're going to look at the color and the ecosystem lines that we can create and kind of the borders in between different patches of land. I'm not going to be using just basic squares as you might see in some landscapes or some farmlands, which we could set up, and we'll take a look at that too. But I want something a little more varied for this type of landscape. And what we're going to do is go ahead and add in a noise node. So right click, go to noise, and we're going to go to flat patterns, and I believe it's varying blocks. And you can see that it's mostly squares, but then it's also got these little areas that come out on the sides. A little hard to see right there. And there's a couple of different patterns that work really well for this. But for now, let's use the varying blocks. Sparse cracks can kind of do some cool things, but we'll stick with the flat pattern for now. So what I want to do is use this to control a color map. We can see here. And now I have some colors I already put into my color selection here. And what I did was I just went, did an image search and just found some reference images and picked out the colors and then just added them into view. So what we need is just to create a color map that has varying amounts of color for the different outputs we're going to get from that noise. And I'm just going along and selecting these and adding them in one by one. And if there's one that's maybe too dominant, you can go back and change it. The dark one looks varied, so we can actually take that and make it a little lighter. And then I separated these more green ones on the left and then the more tan, browner ones on the right. And right now I've got about equal amounts of green throughout here. And if I want, what I can do is either change some of these out, or we can kind of go in between. This one I might use the same one. Let's go ahead and choose a different color. Get some brown showing up in there. And we could go in between as well and add some different ones. They may or may not show up because of the way the clumps and the noise is set up, because it doesn't really have any in-between values. So we might not see a lot of change with the if we're skipping here. But on the base points here, which is about 0.2 steps, and this is -1 to 1. This I think will actually work pretty well. So now we just have a base color. And it's set to world standard for our scale. It's at the moment very small. So what I want to do is change this over to, let's do 100 meters for the preview. And we'll do 100 meters for the function preview. And then we can go into the clumps and scale that up. And start to take a look and see. It still looks like it's way too small, because we did make that terrain pretty big. So scale up to 100. Take a look. And it doesn't look like it scaled enough. Set that to 1 kilometer. And we still want something way bigger, so we can just go ahead and change that overall scale and say 10. Now, because we're working with a 3D material and a 3D world space, what's going to happen is we're going to have some areas, for instance here, where we have a kind of a circle, and that's outlining sort of the shape of the terrain because of the way it's moving through the material. And I'm going to set the main to 10 kilometers. Increase that scale. So what I'm actually going to do is force this into a 2D vector space. And what we can do is go to math nodes. We're going to right click, go to math, vector operation, and we're going to use projection onto a plane. And with that C value set to 1, that is going to be on the Z. Connect that to position and connect that, and we're going to project it. And now if you notice where before we kind of had like a circle cut out, which in some cases might be what you're looking for, but because I'm going to be using a little bit of a vector offset in order to give us our separating lines in between the different patches, it's better that we have this just kind of flat so we can work with it. It's hard to use the just the noise itself because it doesn't have any sort of gradient or any fall off in between the individual blocks, so it's hard to get separating lines, which we would use either for paths or roads or tree lines, and we're mostly going to be looking at tree lines to separate it. So what we'll end up doing is modifying this noise, making a few changes to it, and then what we should be able to pull out a good variety of separation between and kind of get some lines in there. So let's start by just doing that really quick before we go on and add detailed, because we will be able to add crop lines and have them vary throughout in different directions, which is actually pretty simple to set up. First, let's go ahead and I'm going to copy, so select the node, copy and paste it. And we're going to set the origin, let's just start with 0.1. And what that's going to do is bump it up just a little bit on the Z. So there's a tiny bit of difference now between these two. And we should be able to use that in order to get ourselves a line for the in-between values. So what I'm going to do is go to the combiner node, so right-click, combiner, blender. We can take 0 and 1, input 0, input 1. And if you haven't worked with the combiner node, the blender, and this is the blender by default, we have 0, which is going to be the first input, and then ratio of 1 is going to be the second. But what I want to do is take this value and set it to subtract. So now we're subtracting that modified value from the initial noise, and we do need to make a little bit of a change here. So also, so we can get a preview of what's going on here, I'm just going to set up another node that we can just kind of mix in between. Sometimes when you have disconnected values, if I was to close this out and this isn't connected to anything, this blender right here, it might be deleted from the node, so or from the graph. So what I want to do is just set up a blender, and we do need a color output, so I'm going to add in color map, and we just want this to be black and white. Change that, set the output, set that to input 1, and now we can go between 0, which is the main color we're working on, and now this new output here. So let's see how that's going to work. Now, actually, now that I'm looking at it, because we did projection on plane, it might remove that other value. Well, we'll just go ahead and add a filter and see if that takes care of it. So I'm going to add right-click filter and just do a regular manual filter. And what we want to do is set a point at 0 and 0, and then raise up the outside. And I'm going to try to bypass that projection on plane and just see what happens. Okay, it doesn't look like, and it might just be because of the preview. But normally we get, when we do this, boxes around the edges. So we'll see. It could be the scale. And you can see right now we're subtracting, so we're basically getting 0 because they're on top of each other. And then we can go in and we might be able to just make it a little smaller and just try to get those outlines. And it could be just because of the origin and the scale. And before, when I was working on this, I was doing it in a different scale. Okay, so now what I want to do is, after the filter, we're going to add in a filter node. We're going to do map. And this will allow us, because right now what we have is everything leveled out at 0. So we're going to take the lower value, 0 to 1, which is going to take just the gray to the white, and then we're going to output that as -1 to 1. Let's just take a look at it in here. And we're not really seeing outlines. And it looks like it's just probably the origin that's throwing it off. And actually, now that I think about it, I think it is the noise itself, the varying blocks, because they're too square. And I'm going to go ahead and switch this over to clumps. So flat pattern clumps and not varying blocks. And that's going to give us more of the distribution I was looking for anyway. And we can see the farmland here. And that's a little more varied. It's less blocks than we had before, and I think that actually looks better. But because of this now, because of the type of fractal, and like I was saying before, it is difficult to get those outlines when you have those harsh separations between the different colors. It can be hard to get an outline, and you really have to use kind of the right noise. And in this case, the clumps is the better choice. For squares, you'd have to find something that kind of already has a gradient or a fall off, and something you could pull out in order to make those separating lines. So if we take a look, what we can do is adjust the origin in order to adjust the thickness, and you don't want to go too high, otherwise it's just going to block it out. But if I set it to 0.05, it should thin it out a bit more. So we can use this for either mixing it in to create paths in between the different patches of the different crops, or what we can do is use it in order to control, say, an ecosystem and have trees growing in between. That does look a lot better. So the color, and let's just blend that and we can see how it's lining up. And I'm going to bring that back to the color, and we can take a look at the distribution on the terrain. Now, we get these harsh seams in here because of the Voronoi fractal, so we can end up using either a different function to control the terrain. But once we have a bump assigned and possibly displacement, adding in trees and stuff, we probably won't see those lines defined as much as they are. And with this noise, we may not need the projection onto plane either, but I'm going to stick with that just so we're working in 2D. I think it'll be a little easier. So I'm just going to bring us down a little closer to the terrain. And if we have to, we can always change the scale later. Okay, so now what we're going to do is add a little bit of color variance, so we just don't have these flat colors. That's just kind of our base to begin with. And a trick I want to show you involving the color map in order to adjust without having to keep going in and modifying the color map over and over in order to get the look you're going for. There's an easy thing we can do, and what that is, right now we have it set to an upper clamping mode of clamp for upper and lower. Now what this does, if you're not familiar, I'm going to go ahead and add a filter, set it to offset, and put this in between the color map and that output. Once we go beyond certain values, what we end up with is basically just one flat color, either what ends on the 1 or ends on the -1. So if I offset this to 3, we should only see whatever color is set on 1. Let's do -3, and we should see the opposite, whatever is set on -1 down here, that color. So what we can do is repeat or mirror. I think I'm going to mirror. And what that'll do is allow you to repeat it once it hits a certain point. In this case, it's going to mirror it. That's useful if you have a gradient. Now in this case, it's really just kind of flat colors, so we could also just repeat if we wanted to repeat it over and over. Either way will work for this. But once it repeats, it will be a fine, sharp cutoff between these two colors. But since we're just working with non-variable amounts and just flat blocks here, we're not going to have to worry about preserving a gradient, so we don't really need to mirror it. But now what we can do is just offset in order to give us different color variation within the color map. So without having to go in and individually mess with the different color points, we can easily offset it and get some different landscape colors, which is kind of neat. Now what I also want to do is add a little bit of variation to it using color variation. Go to color, and let's go to color brightness variation. Now our color is going to be that color we produced with the color map. And then we can select our output here, and now we can see that color showing up. And I want a larger noise scale. And maybe let's just change it to a color variation. And that way, instead of the brightness and contrast on there, what we can do is easily just adjust the strength without having to mess with it too much. And that adds a nice little bit of variation. And then we can play around with that more if we want. And we're going to be adding more to that color to make it even more realistic, but for now, this is kind of a good starting point. Now for a distant field, this might be enough. It doesn't really have any bump to it, but if you're really far away, it might be all you need. But we're going to go in and create crop lines and add a bump, and then take a look at the ecosystem after that.